The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse office like accusations refusing to be silenced. Marcus Ashford stood motionless before the glass, a solitary figure silhouetted against the glittering sprawl of the city below. At 62 years old, he had everything the world measured as success, and nothing that made him want to wake up in the morning. His reflection stared back at him, silver hair impeccably styled, a suit that cost more than most people earned in a month, eyes that had lost their warmth somewhere between his third billion and his fourth divorce. The office around him was a monument to achievement, awards lining mahogany shelves, photographs with presidents and celebrities, framed magazine covers declaring him a titan of industry. All of it felt like a mausoleum. Marcus turned away from the window and sank into the leather chair behind his desk. The wood was Italian walnut, the chair custom-made in Switzerland. Everything in his life was the best money could buy. Everything except the one thing he'd been searching for since his empire began to crumble from within, someone he could trust. The intercom buzzed. "Mr. Ashford, your attorney is on line 3. He says it's urgent regarding the Hartford settlement." Marcus pressed the button without enthusiasm. "Tell him I'll call back." He insisted it couldn't wait, sir. Then he can learn patience. Marcus released the button and opened the bottom drawer of his desk, pulling out a worn leather journal. The pages were filled with names, dates, and dollar amounts, a meticulous record of every betrayal he'd endured over the past 15 years. Robert Chen, CFO. Embezzled $4.2 million through offshore accounts. Patricia Ashford Morrison, sister. Forged signatures on trust documents. $8.7 million. David Stern, business partner, 23 years. Sold proprietary technology to competitors. $127 million in damages. Jennifer Ashford, wife number 3. Affair with personal trainer. Divorce settlement, $89 million. The list went on for 17 pages. Partners who'd stolen. Lawyers who'd overbilled and lied. Employees who'd leaked secrets. Charities that had misused his donations. Even his own nephew had tried to have him declared mentally incompetent to seize control of his assets. Marcus had won every legal battle. He destroyed careers, bankrupted enemies, and rebuilt his fortune to heights that made the losses seem trivial. But each victory had carved away another piece of his humanity, leaving him hollowed out and suspicious of every smile, every handshake, every profession of loyalty. He closed the journal and stared at his hands, hands that had built skyscrapers and signed billion-dollar deals, hands that had forgotten how to trust. The memory surfaced unbidden, as it often did in his darkest moments. He was 8 years old again, standing in the cramped kitchen of their Milwaukee apartment. His mother, Maria, was crying at the table, an eviction notice crumpled in her work-worn hands. "I trusted him," she sobbed. "Mr. Peterson said if I cleaned his office building for 6 months, he'd help us with the rent. I worked every night after my factory shift. Every single night. And now he says he never promised anything." Young Marcus had felt rage bloom in his chest like a black flower. Even then, he'd understood the cruelty of broken promises, the way powerful people used the desperate and discarded them. "Don't trust anyone, Marcus," his mother had whispered, pulling him close. "In this world, everyone's looking out for themselves. Remember that." He'd remembered. God help him, he'd remembered. Marcus shook off the memory and checked his watch. 3:47 p.m. Diane Carter, his housekeeper, would be finishing her duties soon. She'd been cleaning his mansion for 8 months now, a quiet, efficient woman in her mid-40s who kept her eyes down and did her work without complaint. He'd investigated her thoroughly before hiring her, of course. Single mother, son named Daniel, 14 years old. They lived in a modest apartment in Brooklyn. Diane worked 2 jobs to keep them afloat. Her husband had died 5 years ago, heart attack, no life insurance. She was drowning in medical bills from her mother's diabetes treatment. In other words, she was desperate. And desperate people, in Marcus's experience, were the most likely to steal. That's why he designed the test. His fingers drummed against the desk as anticipation stirred in his chest, the first genuine emotion he'd felt in weeks. Tomorrow, he would leave the safe in his private study unlocked. Not obviously open, but accessible to anyone who tried the handle. Inside would be $50,000 in cash, 3 vintage watches worth $250,000 combined, and a file containing access codes to offshore accounts. He'd installed hidden cameras throughout the study 3 days ago. The security team had been told they were part of a system upgrade. Only Marcus knew their true purpose. Diane would notice the unlocked safe. She was thorough in her cleaning, detail-oriented. She'd see it, and then she'd face a choice that would reveal her true character. And Marcus already knew what she would choose. Everyone failed the test eventually. Everyone took what they could when they thought no one was watching. He would catch it all on camera. Then he would fire her, press charges if the theft was substantial enough, and add her name to his journal. Another entry in his catalog of human weakness. The thought should have brought him satisfaction. Instead, he felt only a bone-deep weariness. Marcus stood and walked to the window again. The rain had softened to a drizzle, and the city lights were beginning to glow in the gathering dusk. Somewhere down there, Diane Carter was probably riding the subway home to her son, exhausted from scrubbing toilets and polishing floors in a mansion she could never afford to live in. Everyone has a price, Marcus murmured to the empty room. I'm just going to prove it once more. But even as he said the words, something twisted in his chest, a feeling uncomfortably close to shame. Daniel Carter sat in the library of Marcus Ashford's mansion, trying to focus on his algebra homework while rain pattered against the windows. At 14, he was all awkward angles and quiet observation, close-cropped hair, intelligent brown eyes that noticed everything, and a habit of chewing his pencil when he was thinking hard. He wasn't supposed to be here. Well, not exactly, not supposed to. Mr. Ashford had given permission for him to wait in the mansion while his mother finished her evening shift. But Daniel always felt like an intruder in this palace of marble floors and crystal chandeliers, as if his mere presence might break something priceless. The library alone was bigger than their entire apartment. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, leather-bound volumes that probably cost more than his mother earned in a month. Daniel had discovered early on that most of them had never been opened. They were just decoration, bought by the yard to look impressive. That had made him sad in a way he couldn't quite explain. Through the doorway, he could hear his mother moving through the rooms with her cleaning cart, the soft swish of her mop, the spray bottle's hiss. She'd been working since 2 p.m. and wouldn't finish until 7. Then they'd take 2 subways to get home, arriving around 9 if they were lucky. She'd make him dinner, help him with any homework he hadn't finished, and collapse into bed only to wake up at 5 a.m. for her morning shift at the hotel. Daniel's throat tightened with familiar guilt. His mother worked herself to exhaustion to give him opportunities she'd never had. The least he could do was get good grades, stay out of trouble, and not be a burden. He turned back to his algebra problems, but his mind kept wandering. This house fascinated and disturbed him in equal measure. It was beautiful, breathtakingly so, but also desperately lonely. Mr. Ashford lived here alone in 23 rooms. Daniel had seen him only twice in the 4 months he'd been coming here, once emerging from his car in a dark suit, phone pressed to his ear, and once standing at a window on the 3rd floor, motionless as a statue. His mother never spoke about her employer beyond practical matters. He pays on time, she'd say. He doesn't bother me. That's all I need. But Daniel had found the test. It had happened 3 weeks ago. He'd gotten up to use the bathroom and taken a wrong turn in the mansion's maze of hallways. Instead of finding the guest bathroom, he'd stumbled into what looked like a home office, smaller and more personal than the formal study his mother cleaned. The room had felt different from the rest of the house. There were actual fingerprints on the desk, coffee rings on papers, a trash can with crumpled notes. Evidence that someone actually lived and worked here, rather than just existing in museum-perfect sterility. Daniel had turned to leave, not wanting to intrude, when his eyes caught on a journal lying open on the desk. He knew he shouldn't read it. Privacy was sacred, his mother had drilled that into him. But the handwriting was angry, slashed across the page with such force the pen had nearly torn through, and his eyes had caught a phrase before he could look away. Everyone fails. Everyone steals. Human nature is fundamentally corrupt. Daniel had frozen, his heart hammering. Below that were names and dollar amounts, page after page of them, each entry a record of theft or betrayal. He backed out of the room quickly, his mind reeling. For days afterward, the words had haunted him. Was that really what Mr. Ashford believed? That everyone was dishonest at their core? And then, gradually, Daniel had begun to notice things. The way security cameras had been installed in odd places. The way Mr. Ashford sometimes watched his mother with an intensity that made Daniel's skin prickle. The way valuable items were sometimes left in conspicuous places, as if daring someone to take them. Mr. Ashford was testing people. Testing his mother. The realization had made Daniel sick with anger and fear. His mother was the most honest person he knew. She'd once walked 6 blocks to return a $20 bill the cashier had given her by mistake. She refused to take even a packet of sugar from the hotel where she worked. "We earn our way," she always said. "We don't take what isn't ours." But Mr. Ashford didn't know that. He just saw another desperate employee, another opportunity to prove his cynical worldview correct. Daniel had kept his discovery secret, watching and worrying. His mother never failed the tests, never touched anything she shouldn't, never pocketed a forgotten bill. But Daniel lived in constant fear that she would somehow, innocently, trigger whatever trap Mr. Ashford had set. The sound of his mother's footsteps interrupted his thoughts. Diane appeared in the library doorway, exhaustion etched into every line of her face. "Almost done, baby," she said softly. "Just the upstairs study left, then we can go home." "Okay, Mom." Daniel watched as she rolled her cart toward the stairs, his protective instinct flaring. "Do you need help?" "No, no. You focus on your homework." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I'll be quick." Daniel nodded, but he couldn't focus on algebra anymore. His mother was about to clean the private study, the one room in the entire mansion that felt like Mr. Ashford's actual sanctuary. The room where Daniel suspected the real test would come. He stood up, too restless to sit, and walked to the window. The rain had stopped, leaving the city washed clean and glittering. In the reflection, he could see himself, skinny, nervous, dressed in jeans with worn knees and a jacket from the thrift store. What would I do, he thought, if I found something valuable? If no one was watching? The question felt important, somehow. Not hypothetical, but immediate and pressing. Daniel thought of his mother's medical bills piled on their kitchen table. He thought of the scholarship applications he needed to submit for high school, and how much better his chances would be if he could afford SAT prep courses. He thought of his mother's shoes with the sole wearing thin, and how she'd shrugged when he pointed it out. "Next month," she'd said. It was always next month. If he found money lying around, money that wouldn't be missed from Mr. Ashford's vast fortune, wouldn't it do more good in their hands? Wouldn't it be a kind of justice, taking from someone who had so much and gave so little? The thoughts scared him because part of him wanted to believe them. But another part, the part that sounded like his mother's voice, whispered, "It's not about whether you need it. It's about who you choose to be when no one's watching." Daniel pressed his forehead against the cool glass. He didn't know why, but he had a feeling that tonight, that question was going to matter more than ever. Upstairs, he heard a door open. His mother, beginning to clean the private study. Daniel's hands clenched into fists at his sides. Whatever happened in the next hour, he silently promised, he would protect her. Even if it meant facing Mr. Ashford's test himself. Even if it meant losing something precious in the process. Diane Carter pushed open the door to Mr. Ashford's private study with the practiced caution of someone who knew her place in the world. This room always made her nervous. It smelled of expensive leather and old books, but underneath that was something else, something that reminded her of the hospital room where her husband had died, a kind of antiseptic loneliness. She began with the windows, as she always did, wiping away rain streaks with methodical precision. Mr. Ashford had been very specific about this room: dust every surface, empty the trash, vacuum the carpet, but don't move any papers on the desk. Don't touch the computer. Don't linger. Diane was good at not lingering. Invisible was safe. She worked her way around the room, polishing wood surfaces until they gleamed. The desk was next. She carefully dusted around the computer monitor, the pen holder, the small bronze sculpture of an eagle that she'd been told cost $30,000. Who paid that much for a bird made of metal? But then, who was she to judge how rich people spent their money? As she moved to clean behind the desk, her cloth caught on something. A drawer in the credenza stood slightly ajar. No, not a drawer. A safe. Diane's heart skipped. The safe was open. Not wide open, but the door was definitely not fully closed, the heavy steel panel separated from its frame by perhaps an inch. She froze, her mind racing. Should she close it? Should she tell Mr. Ashford? Maybe he'd just forgotten to shut it properly. Rich people were careless with their security sometimes, confident that their alarms and guards would protect them. But this was Mr. Ashford. In 8 months of working for him, Diane had learned that he wasn't careless about anything. He noticed when a picture frame was a 1/4 inch out of alignment. He'd once left her a note saying the plants in the conservatory needed to be rotated 15 degrees to get better light. This had to be deliberate. Diane's hands trembled as she sprayed cleaner on the credenza surface. Don't look inside. Don't even think about looking inside. Just do your job and leave. But as she wiped the wood clean, the safe door swung open another few inches, apparently nudged by the vibration of her cleaning. Through the gap, she could see stacks of money. Neat bundles of $100 bills, more cash than she'd ever seen in one place. The breath caught in her throat. How much was in there? Thousands? Tens of thousands? And below the cash, she could see other items, boxes that probably contained jewelry, folders with documents. For a wild moment, Diane imagined what she could do with that money. Pay off her mother's medical bills in full. Buy Daniel new clothes, proper winter boots, the graphing calculator he needed for school but had been too proud to ask for. Maybe even save enough to move to a better apartment, one where the radiator worked and there weren't mice in the kitchen. One bundle of cash. Mr. Ashford would never miss it. He probably didn't even know exactly how much was in there. And even if he noticed, he'd never suspect her, quiet, invisible Diane who never caused problems. Her hand actually moved toward the safe before she caught herself. What are you thinking? Shame burned through her so intensely she felt dizzy. This was exactly the kind of moment her grandmother had warned her about. The devil doesn't tempt you with things you don't need, Grandma used to say. He tempts you with things you desperately want, and makes you forget who you are in the wanting. Diane stepped back from the safe, her pulse pounding. She would close it, finish her work, and leave. Whatever test this was, and she was certain now that it was a test, she would pass it the only way she knew how, by being exactly who she'd raised her son to be. Honest, even when it hurt. She reached for the safe door to push it closed, and that's when she heard the footstep behind her. Diane whirled around, her heart leaping into her throat. Daniel stood in the doorway of the study, his backpack slung over one shoulder, his face pale. "Mom," he said quietly. "What's wrong?" "Nothing, baby. I'm just finishing up." She tried to smile, to act normal, but her son knew her too well. Daniel's eyes moved past her to the open safe, and his expression changed. Something hardened in his young face, something that made him look suddenly much older than 14. "He left it open on purpose," Daniel said. It wasn't a question. Diane's attempt at denial died on her lips. "You know, I found his journal a few weeks ago. He's been testing people. Probably testing you." Daniel's voice was tight with anger. "He thinks everyone steals." Mother and son stared at each other across the expensive Persian rug. In that moment, Diane saw her boy transforming before her eyes, saw him struggling with the same temptation she'd just faced, the same bitter knowledge that the world was rigged against people like them. "We should go," Diane said softly. "I'll close the safe and we'll." "Wait." Daniel stepped into the room, his jaw set. "We can't just ignore this." "What do you mean?" "If we just close it and leave, he'll think we didn't notice. Or worse, he'll think we thought about stealing and chicken out." Daniel's hands clenched at his sides. "But if we pretend we never saw it open, we're just playing along with his game." Diane felt a chill run through her. Her son was right. There was no winning move here, not really. Close the safe and Mr. Ashford would suspect they'd been tempted. Leave it open and he'd think they hadn't done their job properly. Take something and they'd be exactly the thieves he expected them to be. The cruelty of the test hit her fully for the first time. Mr. Ashford wasn't just testing their honesty. He was testing their dignity, their humanity, their right to be trusted. And no matter what they did, he'd find a way to confirm his dark view of the world. I hate him, Daniel whispered, and there were tears in his eyes. I hate that he can do this. That he thinks he can just test people like we're lab rats. Like we're not real. Daniel. And the worst part is, Mom, the worst part is that I looked at that money and I wanted it. I wanted it so bad. His voice broke. Does that make me what he thinks we are? Diane crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled her son into a fierce hug. He was almost as tall as she was now, growing up so fast, and she felt the familiar ache of knowing she couldn't protect him from everything. Couldn't protect him from the knowledge that the world was often unfair, that people with power sometimes wielded it cruelly. Listen to me, she said, holding him tight. Wanting something doesn't make you bad. We all want things. We all struggle. What matters is what you choose to do with that wanting. Daniel pulled back, wiping his eyes. So what do we choose? Diane looked at the open safe, at the money that could change their lives, at the test designed to prove they were exactly what they'd spent their whole lives trying not to be. And then she looked at her son's face, frightened, angry, but also searching. Waiting to see what she would teach him in this moment. We choose to be who we are, Diane said firmly. Not who he expects us to be. She walked to the desk and found a notepad and pen. For a long moment, she stared at the blank page, trying to find words for everything she felt, the anger, the hurt, the stubborn pride of someone who'd never taken a dishonest dollar in her life. Finally, she began to write. Daniel watched over her shoulder as his mother's careful handwriting filled the page. When she finished, she folded the note once and placed it on top of the cash in the safe. Then she closed the safe door firmly, checking to make sure it latched. Come on, she said, taking Daniel's hand. We're going home. What did you write? Diane smiled, though her eyes were still wet. The truth. That's all we have, baby. The truth about who we are. They gathered the cleaning supplies and left the study together, turning off the light behind them. Neither of them looked back at the safe, at the camera hidden in the bookshelf, or at the test that had tried to define them. As they rode the elevator down to the mansion's service entrance, Diane held her son's hand and thought about the note she'd left behind. 3 sentences that had cost her nothing and everything. Mr. Ashford, I found your safe open. I closed it for you. I'm sorry you felt you needed to test me this way. Simple words. But in them was a lifetime of dignity refusing to be bought, stolen, or tested away. And upstairs, in his private office, Marcus Ashford sat frozen in front of his security monitors, staring at those 3 sentences as if they'd been written in a language he'd forgotten how to read. Marcus had to read the note 3 times before his brain would accept what his eyes were seeing. The cameras had captured everything. Diane's initial shock at seeing the safe. The way her hand had trembled as she'd reached toward it, then pulled back. Her son's arrival, their whispered conversation that the audio hadn't quite picked up. The boy's tears. The mother's fierce hug. And then the note. Those 3 devastating sentences. I'm sorry you felt you needed to test me this way. Marcus leaned back in his chair, a strange pressure building in his chest. Not anger, he'd expected that emotion, had been ready for it. This was something else, something that felt uncomfortably like shame. She'd known. They'd both known. And they'd walked away anyway. He rewound the footage, watching again as Diane wrote the note. Her hand was steady despite everything, her face composed. She'd looked like someone performing a duty, a task that needed doing regardless of personal cost. The way his own mother had looked, Marcus realized with a jolt, when she'd cleaned those office buildings after her factory shift. That same tired dignity, that refusal to be diminished by circumstances. No, Marcus muttered, standing abruptly. No, this doesn't change anything. She still could have taken it. The fact that she didn't doesn't mean. Doesn't mean what? That she was honest? That his test had failed to break her because there was nothing to break, because some people actually were what they claimed to be? Marcus paced his office, his thoughts in turmoil. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Diane was supposed to take the money, or at least be tempted enough that he could see the truth in her eyes on the footage. Instead, she'd done something he hadn't anticipated. She'd called out the test itself, had made him the one being examined. I'm sorry you felt you needed to test me this way. The pity in those words cut deeper than any accusation. She wasn't defending herself or protesting her innocence. She was expressing sympathy for him. For the kind of man who would set such a trap. Marcus sat down heavily and opened his journal to the latest page. His pen hovered over the paper, ready to write. Diane Carter, housekeeper. Test results, no theft. Possible. Possible what? Possible she was honest? Possible he'd been wrong? The pen didn't move. Instead, Marcus found himself flipping backward through the journal, through all those names and betrayals. Robert, Patricia, David, Jennifer. Pages and pages of people who'd taken from him, lied to him, used him. But as he read through the entries with fresh eyes, something began to shift in his perception. Robert had embezzled money, yes, but he'd also warned Marcus about a bad merger that would have cost billions, advice Marcus had ignored. Patricia had forged documents, but only after Marcus had frozen her son's trust fund during a family argument, leaving her disabled child without care. David, his business partner of 23 years, had sold secrets to competitors, after Marcus had cut him out of a major deal and publicly humiliated him at a board meeting. The entries went on, but now Marcus saw what he'd refused to see before. These weren't just stories of betrayal. They were stories of relationships poisoned by his own suspicion, his own inability to trust, his own acts of cruelty disguised as business sense. "Oh God," Marcus whispered. The journal slipped from his hands and hit the floor with a sound like a judge's gavel. The room seemed to tilt around him as 15 years of carefully constructed certainty crumbled. He'd been so sure that everyone was corrupt. So convinced that his cynicism was wisdom, that his refusal to trust was protection. He'd worn his bitterness like armor, never realizing that armor could become a prison. And all the while, people like Diane Carter had been cleaning his mansion, raising their children to be honest, struggling through poverty without once compromising who they were. Not because it was easy, but because it was who they'd chosen to be. The pressure in Marcus's chest intensified until he realized with shock that he was crying. He couldn't remember the last time he'd shed tears, probably not since his mother's funeral 12 years ago. But now they came in great, shuddering gasps, as if something inside him was breaking open. He cried for the man he'd become, for the poison he'd let seep into his soul. He cried for the relationships he destroyed with his suspicion, the good people he'd driven away because he couldn't see past his own fear. He cried for his mother, Maria, who'd taught him not to trust anyone, a lesson born from her own pain that had protected him and destroyed him in equal measure. And he cried for the boy he'd once been, the 8-year-old standing in that cramped kitchen in Milwaukee, watching his mother weep over an eviction notice and learning all the wrong lessons about how to survive in a cruel world. When the storm finally passed, Marcus sat in his office feeling hollowed out and strangely clean, as if the tears had washed away some essential toxin. The security monitors still glowed in front of him, frozen on the image of Diane and Daniel leaving the study. The boy. Daniel. Marcus pulled up earlier footage from the cameras, going back weeks. There was Daniel in the library, doing homework. Daniel in the conservatory, carefully examining the orchids his mother tended. Daniel standing at a window, his young face thoughtful as he looked out at the city. On impulse, Marcus switched to the footage from 3 weeks ago, the date written in Diane's employee file as when Daniel had started coming to the mansion regularly. There. The boy, wandering through the hallways, clearly lost. He pushed open a door, the door to Marcus's private office, the one Diane wasn't supposed to clean, the one where Marcus kept his journal. Marcus watched as Daniel froze, as his eyes fell on the open journal. The boy's face had gone through a fascinating progression of emotions: confusion, shock, horror, and finally, determination. He'd read it. Daniel had read the journal, had seen Marcus's catalog of betrayals, his poisonous worldview spelled out in black and white. And then the boy had backed out of the room quietly, carefully, disturbing nothing. He'd never mentioned what he'd seen, never told his mother, or if he had, Diane had given no sign. Instead, he'd just known. He'd known what kind of test was coming, had known what Marcus believed about people. And when the test came, he'd helped his mother pass it anyway. No, not pass it. Transcend it. Transform it from a trap into a statement of dignity. Marcus stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city again. But this time, instead of seeing distance and isolation, he saw millions of individual lives being lived with quiet courage. People working hard, raising families, trying to be decent despite circumstances that often made decency feel like a luxury they couldn't afford. People like Diane Carter. Like her son Daniel. People like his mother Maria had been, before the world broke her. His reflection in the glass looked different somehow. Older, more worn, but also more human. The armor was gone, and without it, he felt terrifyingly vulnerable. But also, for the first time in years, he felt something that might have been hope. Marcus made a decision. It was impulsive, possibly foolish, and completely contrary to every principle he'd operated by for the past 15 years. But it also felt more right than anything he'd done in longer than he could remember. He picked up his phone and dialed his head of security. "James, it's Marcus. I need you to get me an address. Diane Carter, the housekeeper." "Yes, I know it's in her file." "Good. Now I need a car ready in 20 minutes. I don't care that it's almost midnight. This can't wait." He hung up and looked once more at the frozen image on his security monitor, Diane and Daniel, leaving the study with their dignity intact. "Thank you," Marcus whispered to the screen. "Thank you for not letting me win." Then he grabbed his coat and went to do something he hadn't done in 15 years. He went to trust someone. The knock on the apartment door came at 11:47 p.m., shocking in its unexpectedness. Diane froze in the middle of washing dishes, soapy water dripping from her hands. Daniel looked up from the couch where he'd been pretending to read, his body tense. They'd been home for 3 hours, but neither of them had relaxed. The confrontation with the safe had left them both jangled and hyper-aware, as if waiting for consequences neither could name. Who would come this late? Diane murmured, drying her hands on a towel. Maybe Mrs. Johnson from downstairs? Daniel suggested, but his voice was uncertain. Diane checked the peephole and went absolutely still. Then she stepped back, her face pale. "Mom? Who is it?" "It's Mr. Ashford." For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Daniel was on his feet, protective instinct flaring. "Don't open it. He can't just show up here." "You don't have to." But Diane was already unlocking the door, her shoulders squared in a way Daniel recognized. It was the stance she took when dealing with bill collectors or rude hotel guests, the posture of someone who refused to be intimidated on her own ground. She opened the door. Marcus Ashford stood in the dingy hallway of their apartment building, looking profoundly out of place. His expensive suit contrasted sharply with the peeling paint and flickering fluorescent lights. But it was his face that caught Diane's attention, the redness around his eyes, the vulnerability in his expression, the way he seemed uncertain for perhaps the first time in his life. "Mr. Ashford," Diane said carefully. "It's very late." "I know. I'm sorry." Marcus stopped, seeming to struggle with words. "May I come in? Please. I need to talk to you." Diane hesitated, then stepped aside. Marcus entered the small apartment, and Daniel immediately moved to his mother's side, defensive and wary. The apartment was tiny, a living room that doubled as Diane's bedroom, a kitchenette barely big enough for one person, Daniel's small bedroom visible through a partially open door. The furniture was old but meticulously maintained, the space spotlessly clean despite its age and wear. Marcus took it all in with a single glance, and something in his expression crumbled further. "I read your note," he said, his voice rough. "I watched the cameras. I saw everything." Diane's hand found Daniel's and gripped it tightly. "So you know we didn't take anything?" "Yes." Marcus looked down at his hands. "I also know that you knew it was a test. That you knew what I was doing and why." "Your journal," Daniel said quietly, drawing Marcus's attention. "I found it 3 weeks ago. I didn't mean to snoop, I just got lost and—" "You don't need to apologize," Marcus interrupted. "I'm the one who needs to apologize. To both of you." He took a shaky breath. "I've spent 15 years believing the worst about people. Proving to myself over and over that everyone would betray me if given the chance. And tonight, you showed me that I was wrong. Not just wrong about you, but wrong about everything." Diane was silent for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentle but firm. Mr. Ashford, I appreciate you coming here. But I think you should know, I'm going to quit. Marcus's head snapped up. What? No, please, I didn't come here to. I have to, Diane continued. Because I can't work for someone who doesn't trust me. Who tests me like I'm a suspect instead of a person. Her eyes glistened but her voice remained steady. My grandmother used to say that dignity is all we truly own. You can lose your money, your health, your home, but nobody can take your dignity unless you give it to them. Tonight, you tried to take mine. And I won't work for someone who sees me that way. The words hit Marcus like physical blows. He sank into the worn armchair near the door, suddenly looking every one of his 62 years. You're right, he whispered. You're absolutely right. And I don't deserve your forgiveness or your continued employment. He looked up at them, and his eyes were bright with unshed tears. But I'm asking anyway. Not because I need a housekeeper, I can hire any number of people for that. But because I need someone to hold me accountable. Someone who won't let me slide back into being the man I was this morning. That's not my job, Diane said quietly. I know. But maybe it could be. Marcus leaned forward, clasping his hands together. Let me tell you a story. When I was 8 years old, my mother and I were evicted from our apartment. We had nothing, just 2 suitcases and each other. My mother worked 3 jobs to keep us fed. And she taught me that the world was cruel, that people would use you and discard you, that trust was for fools. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the echo of his own situation. She taught me that because it's what she'd experienced, Marcus continued. And I took that lesson and I built an empire on it. I never trusted anyone, never let anyone close, and I was so proud of that. I thought it made me strong. His voice broke. It just made me alone. Tonight, watching you walk away from that safe, watching your son cry because he was angry at the unfairness of the test rather than tempted by the money, it broke something in me. Or maybe it fixed something that's been broken for a very long time. Diane and Daniel exchanged glances. The anger Daniel had felt earlier was still there, but it was complicated now by the sight of this powerful man reduced to vulnerability. What do you want from us? Diane asked. Marcus stood, straightening his shoulders. I want to offer you something. Not a job, not charity, but a partnership of sorts. I have a foundation, the Ashford Foundation. It's been run by managers for years, just a tax write-off, but it has significant resources. I want to restructure it, focus it on helping families like yours. Scholarships for kids like Daniel. Support for single parents working multiple jobs. Real help, not just token donations. He turned to Daniel. And I want you to help me do it. You're how old? 14. In 4 years, you'll be college age. I want you to have every educational opportunity in the world. Full scholarship, no strings attached. And in return, when you're ready, I want you to help me run this foundation. Because I don't trust myself to understand what people actually need. I've been too far removed from reality for too long. Daniel started, overwhelmed. That's insane. You don't even know me. I know you read my journal and didn't judge me, even though you had every right to. I know you wanted to protect your mother tonight. I know you cried not because you wanted the money, but because you were angry at the injustice of the test itself. Marcus's voice was intense. That tells me more about your character than any resume or test score ever could. And what about my mother? Daniel asked, his chin raised challengingly. She works herself to death while you live in a mansion. Is that fair? No, Marcus said simply. It's not fair. Nothing about our current situation is fair. He turned back to Diane. That's why I'm also offering you a position as the Foundation's operations director. Full salary, benefits, reasonable hours. You'd still be working for me, technically, but you'd have real authority and real support. And Diane, his voice softened. You can say no. You can walk away right now and I'll make sure you get 3 months severance and excellent references. You don't owe me anything. The apartment was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and distant traffic from the street below. Diane looked at her son, seeing the hope and skepticism warring on his face. She thought about all the hours she'd worked, all the times she'd been invisible, all the moments she'd swallowed her pride for the sake of survival. And she thought about the note she'd written. The simple act of naming the test had given her power over it, had transformed her from victim to witness. "If I agree," Diane said slowly, "I need you to understand something. You can't test me again. Not ever. If you don't trust me, you fire me. But you don't set traps." "Never again," Marcus promised. "I swear it. And Daniel's scholarship, it has to be his choice. No pressure, no expectations. If he wants to be a mechanic or an artist or anything else, that's his decision." "Agreed." Diane looked at her son again. Daniel gave a tiny nod, his eyes saying, "It's up to you, Mom." "Then I'll think about it," Diane said finally. "But I'm not deciding tonight. You've had your moment of revelation, Mr. Ashford, and that's good. But real change takes time. It takes proving yourself day after day, not just in one dramatic gesture." Marcus smiled, and it was the first genuine smile Diane had seen from him. "That's fair. Take all the time you need." He moved toward the door, then paused. "Can I ask you something? When you wrote that note, 'I'm sorry you felt you needed to test me this way,' did you mean it? Were you really sorry for me?" Diane considered the question carefully. "Yes," she said. "Because I think you must be very lonely, to believe the things you believed. And loneliness is something I understand." The words hung in the air between them, a bridge across the vast distance of their different lives. Marcus nodded slowly, his throat working. "Thank you. For your honesty. For your dignity. For not letting me turn you into what I expected you to be." "That was never your power to take," Diane replied. "That was always my choice." After Marcus left, Diane and Daniel stood in their small apartment, the weight of the evening settling over them like snow. "Do you think he meant it?" Daniel asked quietly. "Everything he said?" "I don't know, baby," Diane admitted. "But I think he meant it tonight. Whether he'll mean it tomorrow, or next week, or next year, that's what we need to find out. And if he doesn't? If this is just another test?" Diane pulled her son close. "Then we walk away with our heads high, just like we did tonight. Because we know who we are. That knowledge doesn't depend on whether Marcus Ashford changes or not." Daniel nodded against her shoulder. "I'm proud of you, Mom. I'm proud of you too, baby. You were so brave tonight." They stood there for a long time, mother and son, holding onto each other in their small apartment while the city hummed around them. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own choices. But tonight, they had won something precious, the right to define themselves rather than be defined by someone else's expectations. And across the city, in a mansion that suddenly felt less like a fortress and more like a very large, very empty house, Marcus Ashford sat in his study and carefully tore out every page of his journal. It was time, he decided, to start a different kind of record. One that counted not the ways people had failed him, but the ways he had failed them. And how he might, with time and effort and humility, begin to make amends. The Ashford Foundation's new offices occupied a modest building in Brooklyn, deliberately chosen to be close to the communities it served rather than in Manhattan's gleaming towers. Daniel Carter sat in the conference room, his notebook open in front of him, listening as his mother and a team of social workers discussed the scholarship program's expansion. At 15 now, he'd grown another 2 inches and carried himself with new confidence. He attended the foundation's planning meetings once a month, taking notes, asking questions, learning. Through the glass wall, he could see Marcus Ashford in his private office, on the phone with a donor. The older man had changed in visible ways. He smiled more readily, laughed occasionally, and the hard lines around his eyes had softened. He'd also changed in ways that were harder to see, the way he listened more than he spoke in meetings, the way he deferred to Diane's judgment on community programs, the way he'd quietly paid off the medical bills of 3 families without making it a public relations event. But Daniel remained watchful. He'd learned something important that night 6 months ago. People could change, but change was a process, not an event. Marcus was working at being different, and that work showed. But Daniel had appointed himself as a kind of guardian, ready to call out any slide back into old patterns. The meeting wrapped up, and Diane caught Daniel's eye, gesturing him into Marcus's office. "Daniel," Marcus greeted him warmly. Your mother tells me you've been looking at high schools. Made any decisions? I got into the Science Academy, Daniel said, allowing himself a small smile. The one with the robotics program. That's wonderful. Congratulations. Marcus hesitated, then said carefully, I hope you know that your scholarship isn't dependent on which school you choose, or what you decide to study. I know. Daniel had tested that promise multiple times, in small ways, and Marcus had held firm. Actually, I wanted to talk to you about something else. The foundation. I'd been thinking about the mission statement. Go on. It talks about helping families in need, which is good. But I think we should add something about dignity. About treating people as partners, not just recipients. Because that's what you didn't do at first, Mr. Ashford. You saw my mom as someone to test instead of someone to trust. Diane tensed, but Marcus leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. You're absolutely right. Do you have specific language in mind? Daniel did. He'd been working on it for weeks. As he outlined his ideas, Marcus took notes, and Diane watched her son teach a billionaire about respect, something that would have seemed impossible a year ago. Later, as they rode the subway home, Diane asked, Do you think he's really changed? Or is he just getting better at pretending? Daniel considered the question seriously. I think both, maybe. He's changed in real ways. But I also think he's smart enough to know he has to keep proving it. And as long as he's willing to do that work, as long as he's willing to be called out when he slips. He shrugged. Maybe that's what change looks like. Not perfect, but trying. When did you get so wise? I have a good teacher. Daniel bumped his mother's shoulder affectionately. They emerged from the subway into the evening air. They still lived in the same neighborhood, though Diane had quietly moved them to a better apartment, 2 bedrooms, working heat, a building with security. She'd refused Marcus's offer to buy them a house, insisting on maintaining some independence. But she'd accepted fair pay, good benefits, and the chance to do work that mattered. And Daniel had accepted the scholarship, with one condition, that for every dollar spent on his education, the foundation had to spend $2 on programs for kids who chose paths that didn't lead to college. Trade schools, apprenticeships, starting small businesses, all equally supported. Marcus had agreed immediately, and then surprised them both by endowing 3 additional programs Daniel hadn't even suggested. As they walked to their building, Daniel thought about that night 6 months ago. About the open safe, his mother's note, and the choice that had changed all their lives. People often asked him if he'd been tempted to take the money. The truth was complicated. He'd been tempted, yes, tempted by the unfairness of it all, by the chance to balance some cosmic scale. But he'd also been angry, and that anger had clarified things. Taking the money would have been letting Marcus Ashford define him. Would have been accepting the premise of the test, that everyone had a price, that honesty was just a facade that crumbled under pressure. By refusing to play that game, by naming the test for what it was, his mother had done something much more powerful than passing or failing. She'd changed the terms entirely. And in doing so, she'd given Marcus something he'd stopped believing he could have, the chance to trust again. The chance to be wrong about humanity. The chance to change. You know what's funny? Daniel said as they climbed the stairs to their apartment. Mr. Ashford thought he was testing us. But really, we were testing him. Testing whether he could handle being proven wrong. Whether he could let go of his certainty and try something different. And? Diane asked, unlocking their door. I think he's passing, Daniel said. Not perfectly. Not every day. But he's trying. That's got to count for something. Inside their apartment, Daniel went to his room to start on homework while Diane made dinner. But first, she pulled out the folder she kept in her dresser, important documents, birth certificates, social security cards. And tucked in the back, preserved in a plastic sleeve, was the note she'd written that night. Mr. Ashford, I found your safe open. I closed it for you. I'm sorry you felt you needed to test me this way. She read it again, remembering the anger and hurt and stubborn pride that had fueled those words. Remembering her son's tears, her own temptation, the moment they'd both had to choose who they wanted to be. 3 simple sentences. But in them was everything she believed about dignity, about honesty, about the person she'd raised her son to become. Diane carefully put the note away. Someday, when Daniel was older, she'd give it to him. A reminder that integrity wasn't about being perfect or never being tempted. It was about what you chose to do when someone gave you every reason to compromise, and you chose not to. Because in the end, that was the real test, not whether you could be trusted by others, but whether you could trust yourself. And that was a test that no one could set but you yourself. The end.